Well, Buzzkillers, guess who it is? It's me, the old professor here. And it doesn't matter how old I get, it doesn't matter how many books I read about history. I'm constantly amazed at the new research that's coming out, and I mean brand new research that's coming out, and the new things I'm learning, and the myths and misconceptions that are overturned in my own head about history, and in particular American history. And fortunately for you, we have on the line over the internet Professor Lauren Lassabe Shepherd, whose new book, Resistance from the Right, Conservatives and the Campus Wars in Modern America, is just out. Professor Shepherd, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Hi, yeah, thanks so much for the invitation.
Well, the first thing I have to mention to the Buzzkillers is that we did, before we started recording, before we pushed the record button, we were having a sort of Sonia Bonchek Appreciation Society meeting. Sonia is the press agent and the media director at the University of North Carolina Press, and sent me your book in draft form, not in draft form, but in early form. And Sonia has this incredible ability to pick exactly the right books for this show. The University of North Carolina Press, Buzzkillers probably don't know, is one of the two or three most powerful and important history presses in the country. And they publish a lot of history books. But when she says to me, Joe, put this book on the show, it's absolutely perfect. So I should have started the show talking about you, but I wanted to make sure to shout out Sonia, who I know is listening.
Yeah, she is fantastic.
Yeah,
Could not have asked for a better PR person.
I think
And
she has
friend,
my
she's just a kind. Yeah, she's awesome.
I think she has my phone tapped and she reads my emails, so she knows what I need. So she's obviously very powerful. But Dr. Shepard, again, one of the things we like to do on the show is overturn misconceptions. And one of the biggest misconceptions about students in the 60s and 70s is that the protesters and the demonstrators and the activists were all left-wingers on college campuses across the United States. And your book shows how completely untrue that is.
Yes, that is certainly not true at all. It's not the case for every student activist. One of the things that I tried to do in the introduction of the book is exactly just bust that myth that the student left definitely received outsized attention. And that's not to say that the student right, who I focus on, was just as large or had as much common student participation. That's not the case either. To be very clear, the right was still a minority, but just like the left, who was also a minority, but maybe a bigger minority, both sides of the campus wars had sort of outsized influence, and the right tended to be ignored pretty often in the media. In fact, one of their campaigns is like creating their own alternative forms of media so that they can, announce their successes, or they'd be writing press releases to send to their local newspapers, and they'd write op-eds, and so they were very noisy, right? So trying to create this illusion that they're bigger than they were. And they love to say that they were ignored by the media. I'm actually repeating that line, and it is to an extent true in terms of how much coverage the left got. Right. So there's this, like, in a historical memory, when we think about the 60s and college campuses, we truly do think all of the 60s, right? Maybe a popular incident or an episode that we remember is the 1964 protest in Berkeley. That's pretty early on in the beginning of the 60s. But the focus in my book is really towards the end of the decade, from 67 to 70. That's truly where most of the activism was. Right in the early 60s, we see lots of Black students organizing, not necessarily for changes on campus, right? They're doing very important civil rights work off the campus. But the activism that took place, like on the grounds, in the quads, in the classrooms, in student underground newspapers, as they were called, that's really towards the later end of the decades. And since I mentioned civil rights, those civil rights students actually take a almost an about face in their techniques. They move from nonviolent resistance to a much more militant resistance. And that is part of the reason that the reactive right becomes quite so noisy, loud, and boisterous at the end of the decade.
Well, before we go too far, I think we should elaborate you're the expert. Elaborate on something you said very quickly in the beginning there, that the left was a minority and the right was a minority on the campus. So
Mhm.
really, does that mean that in the 60s and even into the 70s, the majority of students on college campuses were not politically active on either of the wings?
Yeah. far and away. Most college students in the 60s and the 70s were not activists, really. Well, and I should clarify, most white college students were not activists. Many Black students on campus did their own activism, whether depending on where you are geographically and in time, a lot of it took place off the campus. But yes, I mean, if you were to just pick a random college student out of the pool in 1968, for example, nationally, 95% of college students are white. They self-identify as, politically interested, but maybe a little bit apathetic. They don't have hard ideological allegiances in that way. I mean, the exception really is 1969, 1970, especially in the aftermath of Kent State. But most of the students who would have been politically apathetic or disengaged did find a reason to become activists even for a moment, and that had to do with the draft. Right? That had to do with
Mhm.
their chances of being sent to Vietnam because for readers who may not know this, the draft was reformed under the Nixon administration and it became a little bit more democratic, right? The student deferment didn't always save you, right? So after that and after the US invasion of neutral Cambodia, there's this huge just outburst of protests on the campus. And those protests did involve students who previously had not been so engaged. And then, of course, as soon as the United States starts withdrawing from Vietnam, as soon as the draft becomes not so much of a threat, we see that activism immediately go away. So it's just like this, like a flash in the pan.
Yeah, but of course, the documentaries, the Ken Burns
Mm.
series and all kinds of other stuff, you see that it seems as if campuses are more or less meant to be centers of dissent and meant to be centers of demonstration, but that's not true at all.
That's a good story, right? It's interesting and it does make for great documentaries and it sells a lot of books. I guess I can also put myself in that camp. But yeah, I mean, most college students, they were self-described squares. They were still pretty involved in local church organizations. They weren't really heavy drinkers. And again, I'm saying most, I'm talking about the typical student, maybe not students who are involved in Greek life, male white students who are involved in Greek life.
For foreign buzzkillers, by the way, Greek life in American campuses means fraternities and sororities and often means a lot of, shall we say, partying.
Yes. Hello, foreign listeners. It's great to reach out to all of you. Yeah. So I mean your college students then and even now are not major activists. You kind of see that concentrated maybe and again this can be a trope, especially among the right, but you see a lot of that activism really concentrated in humanities courses and the social sciences where you may have some faculty and graduate students and undergrads who are, extremely passionate about translating what they're studying, what they're researching in the classroom out into the public and, asking for policy change or demanding policy change. And so that tends to sort of cast a shadow, among the rest of the university and the rest of the student population that's not always really representative.
Well, one of the things you show in the book early on is that a lot of this conservative student movement really starts in the 50s and starts, if you will, and this is being, elitist or a ranking preference sort of statement, it starts at the top level with Bill
Mm,
Buckley and M. Stanton Evans at Yale. And it starts really at the sort of ideological, intellectual level and then
mhm.
trickles down through the late 50s and into the 60s. That's a little different than the bubbling up that you might have seen among student activism on the left.
Yeah, it's very different. It's what we would call astroturf rather than grassroots. Yeah, and I mean, of course, we're talking about college campuses. So the intellectual arm of the rights movement was, of course, very powerful because, again, my focus is not in local communities in that way. So one of the things I talk about in the book are the various different factions of the right. And before I get into those, I should just clarify for listeners who are probably already familiar with William F. Buckley Jr., but if you're not,
Well, I'm increasingly surprised at how much he's been forgotten, and certainly how much his
mm,
influence, and in many cases his baleful influence, is completely forgotten.
yeah, he and others are some of the major leaders of the post war conservative movement in the United States. Post-war, of course, it's actually slightly a little later than that, but in 1955, Buckley and others will go on to found the National Review, which is considered even today still the premier journal of opinion on the right. So Buckley is going to be the founder of two of these groups. Young Americans for two of these college groups, Young Americans for Freedom and Intercollegiate Studies Institute.
By the way, as you quite rightly point out, and I didn't know this, and I just dropped my copy of the book laughing. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute, the ISA, was originally called the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists.
Yeah, there's a funny story behind that too, actually. So from what I heard or learned interviewing these former college students, is that to call yourself a conservative was not, it wasn't a popular way to identify. People would look at you kind of sideways. And so for a while, they referred to themselves as individualists. And that was meant to be like a classical liberal, self-styled, like the bootstrappy type of economic conservatism that we're all familiar with. But over the years, individualists kind of fell out of favor. I think there was a joke, and I cannot remember who made it, but it was someone among Buckley's ilk who said individualist makes us sound like we're a society of nudists.
Yeah.
And so they kept the same acronym, ISI, but individualist became Institute. Intercollegiate Studies Institute. But yeah, so Buckley did have a hand in founding these organizations, but that's not where he stays, right? He doesn't spend his long, decades long career working with college students directly. That's kind of a side project. He, of course, will be on the masthead of National Review and does all of these other larger projects. So in a way, the story that I tell about college conservatives and how they're mentored by Buckley and others of this larger movement, the campus is just a reflection of things that are happening nationally on the right anyway.
Okay.
So when I talk about the different campus groups, whether they are intellectual or partisan or activist or Christian groups or even white supremacist groups, as I somewhat of a focus in the book, they're all just smaller microcosms of the right writ large in society. Yeah, so those are the different groups. And I try to explain how initially they don't work well together, right? Because they all have such strong convictions. There are lots of intergroup tiffs and a lot of sort of infighting. And it's through the influence of Buckley and others who are one or two generations older than these students by the time we get to the 70s. So they really do represent like teacher figures or even, some sort of paternalistic role to these mostly young men. They show the students how to work together. And what that looks like is finding the one thing they have in common, which is that they all hate the left.
Yeah.
Right. That's sort of the organizing factor. They all don't like the peace and anti-war movements. They don't like the students in SNCC, of course, a civil rights group.
By the way, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is the full name of it.
Yes. And they don't like students on the intellectual left, right, who are involved in some of these socialist societies or even the W.E.B. Du Bois clubs and other debate clubs on campus, literary societies, right? They all have some problem with them. And so that's the thing that unites strange bedfellows in that way.
But it is interesting because Buckley and Stanton Evans write these books, God and Man at Yale, for instance, The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. That's in 1951. That's only 6 years after the war ends. And their other big book, Revolt on Campus, comes out in 1961. So that's sort of they kind of represent the Old Testament of what you're talking about. And it's really these
founding documents.
Yeah, these newish mid-60s to late 60s activists who are so interesting and so active, frankly.
Yeah, and they really make names for themselves in the 1970s after they've graduated because they use the connections that they've made as college students and as Buckley's mentees to go work for national magazines, or they take jobs as lobbyists or attorneys, and they live in DC. They're influential on the Beltway. They start major think tanks, and they have all of these political connections from their college years. And so in the 1970s, they start calling themselves the New Right, or actually, to be more precise, they do refer to themselves as the New Right in the 1960s because they're trying to position themselves as the opposite of the student New Left. But the New Right really takes hold among journalists who cover their careers and who cover their influence in DC throughout the 70s. And they're people that we are very familiar with today. They're people like Karl Rove, so many others, Newt Gingrich, But when we look at this sort of cohort that eventually will go on to take over Congress in the 1990s as Republican lawmakers and activists in other ways, they're always referred to as getting their start in the 1970s. And that's just not the case. They were already active in the 60s. They were cutting their political teeth. They were learning these lessons. They were learning how to write for public audiences. They were learning how to organize. They were learning how to run voter campaigns and voter registration drives. They were doing all of this when they were 19 years old.
Yeah, it is astounding how sophisticated the whole thing is, both in terms of, actually getting these foundational documents, but also developing the ideology, but then really working very hard on the mechanics of promoting their cause.
Hmm.
Astounding, just astounding.
Yeah, they were extremely hard workers, extremely committed, and I don't mean to flatter them too much, but it is a fact. And one of the things is they're all willing to play the long game.
Mm.
Right? They understand that they're not popular. That is something that is deeply internalized from their time on campus. They know that they don't have the support of the majority of students. But another important lesson that they learn is that it doesn't matter if they're actually in the majority or not, as long as they can claim that and just flood the atmosphere with that sort of propaganda, that sort of misinformation, then through time, over time, that sort of repetition starts to sink in with people. And even if it never does, it doesn't matter, right? That's what their justification is for doing the unpopular things they do. They claim that they are representative of a majority. And of course, that idea that they're a campus silent majority, again, that's an example of what's happening on the campus being a microcosm of the larger political conditions off campus, right? So in the late 1960s, Nixon is the representative of the silent majority, or so he claims. And so that's just the students, co-opting that for themselves and using it in their own way.
Yeah, and you have to think maybe that they actually were in the long run much more successful than left wing college students, because after all,
Sure.
you have Nixon for, I mean, you have very few left wing or even marginally left of center presidents since this period, and you have a ton of very, very right wing presidents and congresses and things like that. Newt Gingrich would have,
Hmm.
is an enormously influential person in American politics and is about as far out there as you can get. It's amazing how it seems to me, and this, I think your book only reinforces this, that the left-wing students sort of want to capture the imagination of the broad populace and
Hmm.
and have mass movements and stuff, which doesn't really ever really happen. But the right-wing students are smart enough to no, no, no. Let's go after what will eventually be the levers of power. Let's help the Federalist Society.
Yeah,
Let's do all of this stuff, and that's what actually ends
absolutely.
up working.
Yeah, that's the long
Yeah.
game. I mean, there's infrastructure building behind the scenes. I mean, and it's just all stuff that they learn when they are college students. So you you talked about, these activists playing an outsized role. One college student that I did not mention in the book because I just couldn't find enough sources. And to be honest, I was terrified to interview him. Was Roger
Yeah,
Stone.
yeah, yeah.
He was involved in the Young Republicans during his time at George Washington. He was extremely active on campus. Like I can find him in the yearbook. I can find him in the college papers in 1972. He leaves campus and then he later comes back and returns and does some more organizing there. But I just didn't have enough to say about him to include him. So yeah, I mean, I do focus on, five or six, sort of major players that many of your listeners may recognize if they keep up with US politics, but there are certainly others who didn't make the cut. So I say that just to emphasize or to underscore that there are so many more people who, got their starts then.
That's interesting that you say that, because I thought one of the most interesting aspects of the book was the way you explain some of your research methodology. Buzzkillers know that historians spend years and years and years in the archives looking at all this stuff, and there's tons of information about this because, of course, activists are always writing stuff down. They're trying to promote their
Mhm.
message, trying to get more members. So there's the archival evidence is measured in feet and miles. That's how much paperwork there is. So you got all that stuff from the time, but you also went off and interviewed as many of these people as you could. Now, this is, of course, many years after they were active, but what was that like, going to interview someone and say, okay,
Oh gosh.
what are your memories of the 60s and 70s like? And they'll start talking, And in the back of your head, you're thinking, yeah, well, you're exaggerating that. That didn't happen because you've already read their own records from the past. So you've got this
Mhm.
problematic historical theory problem of what am I going to do when not Roger Stone because you didn't email him, but when the people you're interviewing, their oral history doesn't jive with what you found as the actual evidence.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you asked that, and I'll add to the list another person I do talk about in the book, but was also too scared to reach out to, and that is David Duke, who is an avowed white
Yeah. By the
supremacist.
way, the reasons Dr. Shepard didn't talk to those two people in particular, they're extremely genuine. These are dangerous people.
Yes, and not just them individually. Like, honestly, if I had a private conversation with David Duke, I think it would be completely fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's his followers I should be concerned about. Anyway, so I'm so glad that you asked that question because so the way that you said it a second ago is, it can be problematic when steeped in the archival record, I sort of understand what's happened based on other primary evidence, and then I interview them and they're telling me something different. So that was actually very important because one thing that I found through all of these interviews is they repeat the same stories and they tell them in really similar ways. And that to me was additional evidence to show how interconnected they've remained. Right? They all have similar, I don't want to say false memories, but they all have a certain interpretation that isn't true that is consistent. And so, of course, many of these men and some women, after they graduate, from college, you can remain a member of Young Americans for Freedom until you're 30 years old. But many of them will go on to found and then join the American Conservative Union or the National Conservative Political Action Committee, which we know as CPAC today. And they are in alumni associations together. So ISI's alumni association, the sort of adult version, is called the
Hmm.
Philadelphia Society. Yeah, and they have annual meetings and, they stay in touch. They have mailing lists. One of the reasons I was able to reach out to literally dozens of these people is because I was provided with a mailing list from one of the members. And he was very kind. He was willing to vouch for me. This is first, the research was part of my dissertation. So he sent introductory letters introducing me, saying this is a doctoral student. She's studying us. Wants to interview you if you're willing to sit and talk with her. And that was so important. And also too, these alumni associations are very, very hard to tap into. So I was able to go to two different Philadelphia Society meetings. And in order to get there, I had to have
Hmm.
three reference letters from members. So I had to build relationships with these people and get them to vouch for me and say, yes, this is, not a threatening participant. She's just here to observe. She's doing, and one of the things I was worried about before I started the interviews is that
Right.
nobody would want to talk to me. How could I expect, to ask people, tell me what you did as a student in the 1960s to stand up to civil rights activists and say that they should be expelled or kicked off of campus for their activism. I didn't think that I would get a warm reception, but I was very surprised. The opposite was true. They were so willing to talk to me, and that's because many of them are in their 80s and they're thinking about their own legacies, and they know that they have their stories lined up. So they're going to tell me, they're going to frame things in certain ways. And that's not to say that they're disingenuous. It's just part of the effect of historical memory. Maybe some of it is, with a wink and a nod towards their own legacy and making sure that they like what's recorded. But yeah, it's hard to break into these groups. You need to build trust over time. I had to rely on many of them to introduce me to the others. And then
Yeah.
some people never spoke with me. Ed Fulner, the Heritage Foundation was one. Actually, there were several people at the Heritage Foundation that didn't want to speak with me. And that's for listeners, that's one of the largest and most influential think tanks on the right that writes all of these policy briefs. Many of the associates at the Heritage Foundation go on to work in GOP administrations.
Hmm. But what seems to me to have happened is in your archival research, you're finding out all these things about these organizations, including their internal disagreements and the way different
Mm,
arguments they have about how things should proceed and what they should do. And yet, when you go interview them, as you say, they've all got their stories straight. And there's this new
mhm.
version of the story that we all were ideologically pure. We all had this great notion in mind, and we all succeeded. And that part of that is because memory is one of the worst things to rely on when you're looking at history, because people change and then they start buying their own hype in effect. But also there must have been some suspicion that, oh, you're coming from academia, therefore you're probably a flaming lefty, and we better have our stories
Yeah.
battened down. Not to say that they necessarily all called each other on the phone or all did a proto Zoom call and said,
It's a shared
yeah, the
suspicion.
Dr. Shepard's on the
Yeah.
way, so come on, we got to get our story straight.
Yeah, I mean, they're all former college students themselves. So, I mean, they understand that academia is not actually, in practice the way that it's sometimes the way that their own people, the way that people on the right frame academia to be. So there's that. And I mean, I think I try to go in as a neutral observer. So I took a course on doing oral histories and on qualitative research and ethnography. And you have to take some of those methods with you, right? To be a participant observer. So not only did I go to the Philadelphia Society annual gathering, I participated, right? I wasn't there with a recording device like a reporter or, a member of the press. I mean, I went to these people's houses. I had lunch with them. Their wives sat me down and some of them showed me their own personal libraries and pulled out artifacts for me, right? So you just got to get in there and let them know that, yes, I am studying you. Yes, I am taking notes about all of this and I'm going to put my own interpretations on top of what you say, but I'm not here as a gotcha,
Right.
right? I'm not trying to embarrass you. So yeah, I mean, it's just a level of trust that you have to build.
Now it's interesting what you say about the wives and the idea, they're the wives are sitting you down and welcoming you, because there does seem to be a major predominance of men in the leadership of all these
Mhm.
organizations, but that doesn't mean that women weren't involved too. And I have a second question about what you talk
Yeah,
about in the book, the emphasis they place on attractiveness, which I thought was very interesting. But let's talk about
yeah.
the numbers of men and the numbers of women first, especially compared with the left.
Yeah, and so the left was definitely a little bit more balanced, and I mean, the left, what does that even
Well,
mean?
yeah.
I mean, there's feminist groups, there's the anti-war left, there's the anti-capitalist left. So I mean, there's of course, there's different factions and proportions are going to look different based on which one you're talking about. But yeah, for the right, I mean, there were women involved. And they were women in leadership positions. There were women on state chairs. There were women who were presidents of their campus chapter. There were women who founded chapters. So one of the most interesting former students that I came across was a Black woman who founded the YAF chapter at Hunter College in
This
New
is Young
York.
Americans for Freedom, YAF.
Yes, and then she actually her name is Myrna Bain. She writes for the National Review. She has several different bylines in other conservative magazines and news outlets or opinion journals. And then she goes on to get a PhD and she becomes a professor of gender studies at CUNY, I believe. So I mean, she does a full political about face, but so she is an example of not only a woman member on the right, but also she's a Black woman. She is the only person that I could find that would fit that description. There were very few Black members in any of these organizations. College Republicans may have had more than a handful, but not very many. So yeah, so I mean, women were present, mostly white women, of course, but they almost had like a token sort of presence. And one of the women that I interviewed, I mean, I asked her directly, how did you feel about being a woman on the right? Did you feel like you were an equal member or, what was that like for you? And so I got different responses. Some women said, yeah, absolutely. It didn't matter that I was a woman. And they would point to women in leadership as, examples to say, like, look, we can rise to prominence in these organizations. And then I had some other women saying, like, oh my gosh, yes, it was a joke. They were still
Mm.
asking us to make cookies or get coffee or run errands. And that's true on the left as well, right? That's been well documented for Black women members of SNCC and Students for Democratic Society, SDS, the other large New Left group.
But there was this interesting added thing about attractiveness. Now, we can understand, and we
Hmm.
remember. Wonder we don't. I barely remember. Most buskillers don't remember. There was a reaction from right wing students or traditional students of being clean cut as opposed to the dirty hippies, right on the left.
Mhm.
You
Yeah. You needed to be a
yeah,
square.
you show that actually goes further, that the campus right wing people were also looking for people not only clean cut, as in short hair and all that stuff for men, but actually attractive. So that was almost like a conscious
Mhm.
policy, as if, well, they'll look better on TV, they'll make our message across better. And I found that absolutely gripping.
Yes, and to keep going with that example, they'll look better at registration tables when we have events and we're signing up new students. We want the most attractive people we can find. The strategy is less associated with YAF than it is with college Republicans. So college Republicans purposefully fundraised off of their good looks.
Hmm.
Right? They would send the most attractive members around to, knocking on doors, asking for financial donations. They would, when they did fundraisers on campus, they would get the homecoming queen or the football quarterback to, come do an event with them, right? So they're trying to show like, aren't we attractive people? And of course, they're all white. So yeah, does go a step beyond just looking clean, right? Not looking like a hippie, but actually looking like someone from a beauty pageant. And yeah, I mean, just this week, Congress has been all caught up about the dress code,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, these sort of conversations, they're still around, and certainly we have much bigger fish to fry in Congress, and our representatives should be doing other things than working on their dress code right now. It's important. I mean, that sort of respectability politics and how you look is still very important all across the political spectrum.
Was there any indication in the sources of how that was working? Are there memos back and forth between the leaders of Young Americans for Freedom and college Republicans saying, oh, yes, the more we send out pretty women, the more members we get? I mean, maybe they weren't tracking it to that level, but you know what I mean? Was there anecdotal evidence that, oh, yeah, we
Yeah,
need to send out the cheerleader types, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
I can't specifically remember anything that spelled it out quite to that level, but I think it was just I mean, it didn't even need to be implied
Mm.
because it was so ingrained in the culture. It was so obvious that, they didn't need to spell it out besides just to remind people like, hey, you'll get the homecoming queen to read the names of, the people who entered our drawing. No, I think it truly was internalized.
Well, then how did they transition from college into the working and in some cases political worlds in the early 70s, mid 70s? Were they automatically, were a lot of them automatically sort of picked by the Nixon administration and Reagan administration and said, "Oh, yes, well you were the head of and so now you're going to be the assistant to the assistant to the assistant to the president."
Oh, much more powerful positions than fourth assistant. Yeah, so some that's a great question. So in Nixon's first term, so after his election in 1968, there are two Young Americans for Freedom leaders who will go on to work. Actually, there's more than two, but the two that come to mind are Tom Charles Houston and Pat Buchanan, who will later run for
Hmm.
president himself. So they're involved in Nixon's first term, and I think more will sort of trickle up into his second term. But yeah, they get their jobs specifically because of their YAF connections or their ISI connections or, whatever it was. I mean, these clubs are pipelines into job opportunities just because you make so many professional connections and there's sort of a level of trust. And it's the way we talked about the Greek system earlier. It's the way that fraternities and sororities work today. If you're an alum, you have an easier time networking with other alums. You just, hi, it's me, right? We even if we've never met before, we're steeped in the same culture and you know what I know. And so I'm just like you. If you're a good fit at your employer, I will be too. And so there's that. But I mean, also, not just the Nixon and Reagan administration. The administration is just overblown with alumni from these college organizations, but even law firms, the think tanks, and some of them stay in academia. So David Keene, who was one of the most important people that I talk about in the book, he'll go on to be the president of the National Rifle Association. He's a lawyer by training, but he stays in academia, right? He goes on through grad school. I talk about like the different generations. Like by the end of the 1960s, Buckley would have been almost two college generations. So not like 20-year generations, but like two class cohorts ahead of the students. So David Keene is an example of someone who is also several class cohorts ahead of undergraduates he's training when he is working on his JD. Yeah, so they're long connections and they're like a spider web. I mean, they're spread out all over the place.
Yeah, and this seems to me to be almost entirely different from the left. For instance, Jerry Rubin, the hippie, doesn't ever become a politician, or certainly is never placed in any administration. Angela Davis doesn't become,
No.
President Carter's. Doesn't become a cabinet secretary. And it just seems to me that these right-wing organizations are so much more successful. Maybe Gingrich is the exception in the sense that he actually becomes a public politician, whereas the rest of them become, again, in the administration.
Not just Gingrich, Paul Rove, Bill Barr, Jeff Sessions.
Yeah, they're not elected representatives as much as they are working in the administration behind.
Okay,
And
political
that's what
appointments,
interests
sure.
me so much, because they decide, this is obviously conscious because they want to craft their own careers. They decide that the power
Sure.
how they can influence power better by going into administration rather than running for office. And so not only do
Right. Well, they don't like
well, there's
democracy
that. Yeah.
anyway. They understand that they're unpopular, right? So it's better to just, pull the levers of power behind the
But it's
curtain.
almost as if the left-wing activists go off into either oblivion or into just sort of general movements. I mean, John Kerry is sort of the exception in this. He becomes eventually a politician. But the right-wing activists, they go for the jugular. I mean, they go right to D.C. There's almost a pipeline. And that, to me, is an astounding difference. And now maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but it just seems to me.
No, you're not. You're not. Actually, who just came to mind when you mentioned Kerry is Mitt Romney, who was also a college activist. I don't talk about him in the book, but he's another example. Yeah. So this is a heavy question, and there's so many different ways you could go with this. But your example of like Jerry Rubin and Angela Davis. So a lot of the leaders on the left didn't have these sort of. I mean, of course they want to affect politics and policy in the sense that they want to change things. I mean, they are revolutionary, truly. Angela Davis, I'll speak on her. There's not the ego there of like, I want to be the one, and I
Yeah.
want to, rise to, political office to do whatever. I mean, Angela Davis is about as grassroots as you can get.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the other difference. When we opened this conversation, we talked about how the left was very grassroots, the right is much more astroturf. And so you see that trickle up or trickle down in the same way, right? Grassroots activists tend to stay on the grassroots, or if they do rise up, it's because other people push them there. Whereas the right
Yeah.
is like, tell me what I need to do. I want to become, I have these political personal aspirations. Who do I need to know? Whose hand do I need to shake? I don't talk about that in the book at all, but I think that's a great point.
But I think that's why
Yeah.
they're one of the reasons they're so effective. They effectively leapfrog the public and go right into administration, and they leave the rhetorical activism and that stuff to the Rush Limbaughs, to the talk radio people, whereas the left wing activists actually are still go out there and try to convince the masses. And I'm wondering whether that's why that hasn't worked.
I don't know that it hasn't worked. I mean, if you took the temperature of the average American, they're not like some, MAGA operative
well, you're
or,
right. Yeah.
whatever. I mean, the Republican Party has not put up a candidate for president who has won a popular vote this century, right? So
Yes, that's amazing. And please repeat that for the Buzzkillers. That's an astounding statistic that I'd forgotten.
yeah, I mean, the GOP is absolutely not interested in being popular right now. They're interested in holding on to power. And I mean, we can see this with like the recent overturning of Roe versus Wade, or any number of things that the Supreme Court conservative supermajority has done this term, or that Congress has done. I mean, these things are not popular with the American people. But of course they don't need to be popular to be powerful. All they need to do is just get into the position and hold on to it as long as they can. But going back to the left, I mean, the average American's politics are certainly not leftist, right? I mean, they're maybe somewhere. To me, a centrist is just a liberal.
Yeah.
I'm not a political theorist here, so I know you might have some angry emails saying this woman doesn't know what she's talking about. But
No, I don't think so.
I say in the book, the right didn't win the campus wars. The left didn't win them either, but they did have much more sympathy from, the average person who might have been politically disengaged. And I think that's true with larger voting populace, right? They don't like MAGA extremists. My own dad, I use him as an example all the time. My dad is very conservative. He voted for Trump both times. He doesn't know who Lauren Boebert is. He doesn't know
Yeah,
who
yeah.
Marjorie Taylor Greene is, right? Because he gets his political news, he gets this information through his Facebook algorithm, and they don't tend to show their own extremists. So, I mean, he can tell you everything about Hunter Biden.
Yeah.
He could tell you every truth and every conspiracy. I tweeted something about this the other day. But yeah, I mean, the GOP, Republicans, conservatives, the far right, they don't have to be popular to be in power. And it's worked very well for them for at least 3 decades.
Yeah, and that's absolutely crucial. It's 3 decades of this, and that is amazing. Well, Buzzkillers, we have talked really only about part one of the book, and then we sort of leapfrog to the conclusion. But part two of the book is so important, and we don't have time to talk about it here. But of course, we want you to get the book, and it's on the Buzzkill bookshelf. Obviously, part two is called Law, Order, and Punishment, and has some of the best chapter titles I've ever read. Listen to these. Chapter 5. Apple Pie, Mother, and Nixon. If that doesn't absolutely completely encapsulate what was going on the right wing in the 70s, I don't know. And then one of Mickey Mouse, William Buckley's is another great title, and Tell It to Hanoi is another. And finally, Chapter 9, The Worst Type of People. Now, we can't explain the details of this, but Dr. Shepherd, I mean, part of these you're using quotes from things that people said, but these are absolutely,
Yeah, they're all
they're
quotes.
absolutely perfect examples of how academic writing can really be glittering.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. And actually, you know what? Since you said that, I wanted to shout out another historian, Seth Blumenthal, who has a phenomenal book. If readers were interested in my book, his book is about the student silent majority, students who were campaigning in 1968, 1972 for Nixon. And it is from Seth's research that I found the source that gave me the apple pie mother and Nixon. But yeah, that's another great book too. And I will say, if I can just entice readers a little bit, part two is the juiciest part of the
Yes, it
book.
is.
It's
Yeah.
actually, it was my favorite to write, and it's just got the best stories. So if you want to read the tea, jump straight to part two.
That is we are majorly teasing this because I think it's an extremely important book, and it's extremely important that Americans and buzzkillers generally, because this sort of stuff happens in all countries, read this. So it just remains for me to thank you so much, Dr. Shepherd, for coming on the show.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks to Sonia for coordinating our
Yeah,
connection.
Sonia, by the way, I'm going to have to change my phone number because you tap it so much. But if you keep sending me books like this, maybe I'll just turn the entire Buzzkill Institute over to your control. So, Buzzkillers, again, Resistance from the Right, Conservatives and the Campus Wars in Modern America is on the Buzzkill bookshelf, the blog post for this episode. So, again, thanks to Dr. Shepherd, and we will talk to all of you out there again next week.